How many times do I have to address these kinds of comments before people realize that this is in fact a hardenable metal? Back again, and today we are going to be discussing something that is, for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason has become a controversial topic on YouTube amongst blade makers. Rebar. You know, every time I make something out of a piece of rebar, I get comments like this. And granted, this gentleman is a welder, so I would assume he's learned in his welding courses that you're not supposed to weld rebar for construction purposes because it makes a heat-affected zone. It weakens the rebar. That in and of itself is a form of heat treatment. Welders are told that they can't weld rebar for construction purposes. This is why you often see that wire tied like this instead of welded, because it can heat treat the metal. This can cause brittle areas that can break easier. Now let me be very clear. I'm not saying that all rebar is created equally. That's why you have grades of rebar, and different grades of rebar are equivalent to different types of steel. Grade 40 rebar is basically mild steel. You would be correct in saying that rebar is mild steel if you are referring to grade 40. However, if you're talking about grades 60, 80, and 100 rebar, you would be very wrong. Grade 60 rebar is roughly equivalent to 1045 steel. Grade 80 rebar is roughly equivalent to 1060, and grade 100 rebar is roughly equivalent to 1070, which are all forms of carbon steel that are indeed hardenable. So, if you're not using grade 40 rebar, it's perfectly fine to make an edge tool out of it. Do you need to do specific types of quenches to these materials? Yes, but that applies to every steel you will ever encounter. W2 is a water hardening steel. You're not going to treat it the same as 5160, which requires an oil quench. All I'm saying is just because something is rebar does not make it mild steel, not by far. And I've had enough of these comments where I felt it necessitated making a video to clarify this subject. Rebar is in itself not all the same. One of your first giveaways is just look at what the grade of rebar you're dealing with is. If it's grade 40, great, that's mild steel. Use it for artistic projects. Don't make tools, don't make edge weapons out of it, things like that. The main factor is knowing which type of rebar you have and knowing how to heat treat it correctly, knowing what type of quench you need for that type of material. Now, I can understand a lot of guys just hear this all the time, that rebar is junk steel, you don't want to use it for anything, but they are misleading you. They either don't know or they simply don't care. It's a bias that the internet is full of in terms of the metalworking community. And it's really sad to me that a lot of people don't realize that you can use rebar of certain grades for other projects, aside from just artistic pieces that aren't going to require hardening. Because rebar is such an easily accessible and cheap steel, it's amazing to me that more guys don't actually talk about this and say, why don't you find the right grade of rebar and use it for the right function? This does require a little bit of knowledge of metallurgy and quenching, but if you're a bladesmith or you're a blacksmith, you should know how to quench. You should know how to test your steel for carbon content. A simple spark test will verify how much carbon is in that metal based off the spark pattern. A straight, non-explosive, let's say, spark would indicate a milder steel, whereas a brighter, more fracturing, let's say, spark would indicate more carbon in the steel. You can do some pre-testing for quenching. Cut a small piece off, forge it out flat, try a couple of heat treat methods on it and see which one works the best for the piece of rebar you're dealing with. This will tell you what type of heat treatment you need for that specific piece of bar to get the best qualities out of the steel. I actually find it kind of hilarious that a quick 10-second Google search will disprove the argument. When people say rebar can't be hardened, well, just do a quick Google search. Yes, it can be hardened. Now, is it going to give you the same type of properties as 5160? Absolutely not. This is not going to make the same level of strength as a 5160 blade. But guys make knives and swords out of 1045, 1060, 1070, all that kind of stuff all the time, and nobody bats an eye. But the moment you say it's rebar, instead of 1045, 1070, 1060, people freak out and say, oh, it can't be hardened, it's junk, it's not good. They would be very wrong. So I just don't understand why this is such an issue. And I think, personally, it's probably because of a lack of metallurgical knowledge on behalf of the people that are saying these things. Either they've seen it online in other comments, or they heard it from somebody that's supposed to know what they're talking about, and they didn't realize rebar is not all junk steel. Grade 40, I wouldn't use that for a blade. I would only use that for guards, pommels, artistic pieces, things that aren't going to take a lot of impact. But something like grade 80, 100, things like that, yeah, you can make that into a sword. It'll hold an edge, it'll flex, if you heat treat it correctly. I'll just pop up a little reel over here while I'm chit-chatting of some of the things I've made out of rebar being used. You'll see me smack it into stumps. You'll see me cut things with them after smacking them into stumps to show they hold their edge. They flex just fine. I've made double-bladed swords like this one that were incredibly thin. That was grade 60 rebar. It performed just fine. It cuts, it flexes, and returns to true. It is a hardened rebar blade. So before you go hating on rebar and thinking it's just a bunch of trash metal fit for nothing but the garbage, look into the specs. Look into the carbon content. Learn how to heat treat. Because I guarantee there's a lot more to this simple little bit of recycled steel than you would think. But that concludes my rant on rebar. I've already said my piece, and if you need more proof, just look at videos like this, where it will basically show you step by step the grain structure and everything on how to heat treat rebar for proper edge retention, for proper ductility, things like that. There's other blacksmiths like Black Bear Forge that are very well known that can show you how to test and troubleshoot what kind of steel you're dealing with if you don't know what grade of rebar you're dealing with. All kinds of other videos on YouTube that disprove the argument that rebar cannot be hardened. You can harden mild steel. You can harden wrought iron. It just depends on what process you use to do so. And if there isn't enough carbon, you can always introduce carbon into the steel by methods like case hardening and things like that. But that does it for today's video. If you guys liked what you've seen, do me a favor, do that thing right there. Until next time, God bless, stay sharp out there. If you're looking for a custom hand-forged object like a sword, knife, polearm, or whatever, check out Mancy's store. Link will be at the end of the video. Leave your thoughts and questions down in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.